Last week we talked about how we teach anatomy here, but that's only half the story, because most of the work isn't in the teaching, it's in the learning, the studying. So what are the top tips for studying anatomy? Can you hear the washing machine going in the lab with washing lab coats? This is about that time of year where certainly in some countries people are starting new courses, they're starting to study anatomy. I've left it until now because our students are a handful of weeks in, so they've been figuring this out for themselves. But what are my top tips for teaching anatomy? Not just my top tips, but published research top tips and tips that I get from my students. So what I do is I talk to students a lot because I want to find out what the students that do well in anatomy do, and I talk to students that don't do so well in anatomy and find out what they're doing, and then we kind of mix the two together and work out how that student might improve their methods of learning, just to try to help them with their own unique needs, right? Again, this is one of those things I talk about all the time. I've made videos about this before. I should probably make a video every year at about this time of year to help everybody along. There are a few things that are a bit special about trying to learn anatomy. It's physical, it's three-dimensional. You have to kind of imagine, you have to be able to recreate those three-dimensional shapes in your mind. It's not just about structures, it's also about function. There is a huge amount to learn, so there's a large volume of knowledge, and it takes a long time to learn. On top of that, anatomy is a foundational science. It is the basis of medicine, it's the basis of biology. So on the one hand, it takes a huge amount of time to study it, but on the other hand, it's well rewarded. In most courses where you're using anatomy as part of the course and you're studying, that anatomical knowledge will come up in assessments, will come up in your job, and a lot of the time, it'll be at such a fundamental level for you that you don't even notice you're using this knowledge anymore. It's just part of your everyday understanding, it's part of your language. But right now, when you're starting to learn anatomy, it feels like a lot. And it is a lot. So, first of all, pace yourself. You don't need to know it all now. We're going to learn it in bits, and however you study anatomy, however you break it up into chunks, it's always wrong. Because the systems and the regions, you need to know this bit to know this bit and so on. So just pace yourself, be kind to yourself, be patient, and your learning has been given to you probably in some sort of structure. Just give yourself a bit of time each week, put it into your schedule, do a bit of pre-reading before the teaching session if you can, which will help the language develop so much faster. And be patient, learn a little bit each week, and eventually it will build and it'll all start to lock together and it'll start to make more sense. A top tip I had from a current student was play with it, play with anatomy, and in that respect she meant this is what you need to study this week and this is what you need to study next week, and often students then start reading around. If you find something that's interesting, go and explore that thing. Let yourself go and explore that thing, although be aware of how much time you have and all the other things you have to learn. So let yourself go and explore, but don't feel like you need to know it all now. It's going to come up later. Anatomy is very three-dimensional, and a lot of anatomy assessment is about recognition and recall. So students tell me, and I tell students, and there's loads of published data on this, if you've got access to three-dimensional resources like this, plastic models, cadavers, spend time with the plastic models. You will learn faster, you will learn more deeply, and if I'm doing a recognition and recall exam, I'm usually putting pins in these things. So if you've already studied all the models in the lab, not only is your anatomical knowledge going to be good, but when you see that in the exam, you're 3/4 of the way there already. Another top tip I hear from students all the time is multimodal. Use lots of different things to learn. And that matches what I say as well. So of course you've got your textbooks and your illustrations, or you've probably even got your favourite online resource rather than a textbook these days. And you've got your models, you've got your cadavers, you've got your surface anatomy, and you've got your computer-generated 3D anatomy models, the apps like Complete Anatomy, Visible Body, Biodigital Human, all those sorts of things, look at the anatomy in lots of different ways. Now, students like variety, but I think that if you look at it in different ways, something will click with you. And if you're looking at something complex, something will click and you'll, oh, that's the shape of that, and that's the thing, and that, do you see what I mean? Also, the thing about being multimodal is sometimes there are errors. There are errors in things that I say, there are errors in textbooks, there are errors in apps. By looking at multiple sources, multiple resources, you can be sure that what you're reading is accurate. Leads into another top tip I got from a student the other day, which matches what I do when I'm preparing to teach. They use Google Images, I use DuckDuckGo. But if you search for your topic, and then Google Images will just give you lots and lots of images, right? So you'll see all the images on the web relating to that anatomical topic that you're interested in. For one thing, if they all say the same thing, then you know that information is probably correct. But also, again, you can see lots of different illustrations, and one of those illustrations will probably work for you, and that'll be the one that, oh, now I get it. So that's a very easy way of looking at lots of images from lots of different sources in one go. Those CG anatomy apps, those 3D anatomy apps, they're not really 3D. It's a 3D model, but you're looking at it through a 2D display, unlike this guy. It does make a difference. We've got two eyes, our brains perceive the world based on the information that comes in through both eyes. The future might be VR and AR and XR, but we're not there yet. And the software is really not there yet. Anyway. But watch out for that, is that when I say 3D resources, I mean proper 3D shapes you can perceive with your two eyes, because then you can see shape, you can see size, and it's clear to your brain where one structure is relative to another structure. 3D anatomy apps on your iPad are 2D displays. You're learning anatomy, you're learning the fundamental science behind medicine and biology, because you're learning the language of the body. And when you're learning a language, I don't know about you, but I find it impossible to hear the word and imagine what that word looks like unless I've got really good at that language and I understand, or I can have a good guess at where the letters go. I'm trying to learn German at the moment, so I understand the problem here. This is why in my videos I have lots of labels, because I'll say a word, but you need to see that word written down to link the sound to the shape of the word. This is what pre-reading does before a teaching session. You've seen the word, and then you hear the word in the teaching session, and it goes in so much faster. But if you're learning a language, you need all of this. You need to practice it, you need to read it, you need to hear it, you need to speak it, you need to write it. So I like to try to get students to work in small groups, maybe not all the time, but find a group that you're comfortable with, comfortable making mistakes with, and you can grab a model and teach somebody, or you can grab a model and question somebody. And by teaching each other and questioning each other and just talking to each other, you're using the language of anatomy, and it will become natural. And the more time you spend doing that, which if you're studying medicine, you're going to be talking this language all the time anyway, the faster you'll learn it and the easier it will be. The other thing I like about working in groups is that error correction thing again. If you're working in a small group and you're comfortable with each other, you should and can pick each other up on errors that you think you're making, because not only will that fix errors in understanding or knowledge, but that moment, that interaction, that possible argument will cement that memory, that learning inside your brain. There are things I remember from the 90s when I was first studying anatomy that I still use to help me remember things like afferent and efferent. We had those arguments and they got cemented in my brain, and now that's part of my recall, and my recall is reliable as a result. I'm not sure if these two tips work together or against each other, but part A, however deeply you look, you will always find more detail, and that goes on forever. So in the first instance of learning a topic, try to get that general knowledge. Try to group things together to make it easier to learn things. Muscles of the forearm, there are lots of muscles here, lots of layers. You can learn all their names, you can learn all their insertions and origins, and you can learn the nerve that innervates them and the blood vessels that run through here. What's the most important thing? It's what they do. You've got muscles that flex the wrist, you've got muscles that flex the finger, and they are pretty much all innervated by the median nerve. Guess what information is most useful clinically? And so guess what information is most likely to be assessed, right? People lose function. Why? What's happened? Whereas the insertions and the origins, if you can name all the bony bits, that's a lot of detail. If you have a visual understanding of where they attach, that helps you understand the function of the muscle. And that's part B, that's the second tip, is as you're learning your anatomy, and I said it's about recognition and recall, if you're learning about a structure, learn what it does. So learn the functional anatomy at the same time as the anatomy. Yeah, and again, just in a broad strokes. If you look at tables in textbooks, they can be your worst enemy because they have all the detail in there. But understanding that musculocutaneous nerve does that, the median nerve does that, the radial nerve does that, and does that, that's a huge amount of important information in just a few ideas in a few sentences. Here's a tip I hear all the time from students. Students love flashcards. Yeah, good for practicing that recognition and recall. And there are lots of flashcard decks around. I'm not advertising Anki, not sponsored by Anki, but Anki is the one students tell me about a lot. Quizlet, is that another one? I don't use flashcards. Apparently there is a Sam Webster Anki deck floating around. I didn't make it. It's probably from a collection of questions I have made though. Anyway, students tell me they love flashcards, but they tell me they get so much more value from creating flashcards than from just using the flashcards. And that I recognize in teaching and in getting students to do peer-to-peer teaching. Washing machine's finished. You have to understand the material so much better. You have to understand it really well to be able to write a good question. I know a flashcard is often just a photo and a whole bunch of labels, but you have to understand the anatomy to be able to make that flashcard. And you going through that exercise of making the flashcard really imprints that understanding and that knowledge on your memory, on your recall. Make flashcards. On top of that, I always say, I liken learning to preparing for a race. The further you are away from the exam, the more general learning you should do with a little bit of testing. The closer you get to race day, the closer you get to the exam, the more your training should become a little bit more race-like, so we get a bit faster and what have you. So your learning should get a little bit more practicing, testing as you get closer to the exam. Do more testing closer to the exam, do more learning further away from the exam. Another tip, one that's been popular with students for a long time and popular with some students and not others, but something I've shifted towards in recent years, and that's drawing. So anatomy and histology, it's a very, very old subject. And when it was first studied, the way to make records was to draw what you saw. The importance here is, as artists know, it's careful observation. To draw something, you have to look really, really carefully at your subject. And that's what's happening here. If you grab a model of a heart and you want to do a drawing of it, you are going to very carefully, you're going to be forced to look at the detail of that heart model and then add your labels. Surprisingly, this doesn't take as long as you think. The more practice you get, the better you get at it, but I find that it's surprisingly quick to make a little illustration. The secret here is nobody else ever has to see what you've drawn. You can keep it just for you. So it doesn't matter if you're not confident in your drawing or you don't think it's good. It doesn't matter. It's just for you. But like the process of making flashcards, the process of making a drawing can really help you remember the anatomy and see the detail in a way that you haven't seen before because you haven't properly looked. Are you still struggling? Anatomy takes a lot of time, so one of the biggest challenges can just be putting time into it. If it's interesting, it's easy. If it's not interesting, it's difficult. Luckily, there are so many different resources you can use now. But there are also tricks you can use. Students often love mnemonics, wordplay to help you remember things. I'm terrible at mnemonics. I can't remember the mnemonic, let alone what the letters stand for. But what you can do is you can use magician's tricks. So you know how a magician can shuffle a pack of cards and then learn the sequence, the order of those 52 cards in the pack in a very short period of time and then recite them. What they're doing there is they're making up a story, and they're making up the most outrageous, lurid story they can as they're looking at each one of those cards. They're imagining the cards are characters dressed like this, look like this, doing this appalling thing, and interacting with the next card as they go through the pack. And by doing that, when they then go back to the pack, they can use that story to recount to you the sequence of cards in that pack. And it's an amazing trick. It takes a huge amount of practice, but you can do the same thing with anatomy. If you're learning anatomy for healthcare and you're trying to learn something, make up a patient. You can make up a patient, and of course this is just in your mind, so you can make this patient however you want, however wonderful or awful as you like. Maybe they, whatever works for you, this patient, this character. And if we go back to the example of the hand, they presented with this loss of function, and that was because this nerve is injured at this point through whatever trauma you want to make up, and that nerve would normally innervate these muscles. And you can imagine that scenario. That helps a lot of people, instead of just rote learning things in textbooks, make up these patients, these cases. And if you get clinical experience, you will see clinical cases. And if you don't understand what was going on in that clinical case, great opportunity to go and look it up. And then you can link those two things together, and then you're not just recalling the dry anatomy, you're recalling that person, their problems, why they had that problems, what the solutions are going to be. And you can imagine how that's going to arm you for the future, right? A well-known top tip is to teach. To teach is to learn twice. I'd say to teach is to learn about 5 or 6 times, to be honest. It can be informal teaching in that little group. It can be more formal teaching. We run peer-to-peer teaching here in Swansea, and the students that get the most out of this are the students that are somewhat weak in anatomy. And you might think that's counterintuitive. How can you have someone that's weak in anatomy teaching anatomy to another group of students? It works fine. The teacher, because you're going to have this session where you're going to stand up in front of some people and teach, you really try to read around the subject and understand it as best you can. You become braver about asking questions of people like me, so you really understand it, and then you teach it. So peer-to-peer teaching, near-peer teaching, teaching anatomy is a fantastic way of learning anatomy. I've made 400 or 500 videos, and that's really helped my learning. I understand anatomy so much better now. If after all that you still find anatomy hard, and you find it hard not because it's not interesting and not because you're not putting time into it, you're putting time into it, and you're still finding it really difficult to remember things, it might be to do with your visuospatial ability, the ability of your brain to work with three-dimensional shapes inside your mind and move them around and what have you. There used to be online tests, you could measure this. And if you have a poor visuospatial ability, studying anatomy tends to take longer. It also benefits from using these three-dimensional resources because you don't have to imagine so much, because you've got the three-dimensional physical thing in front of you and in your hands. The worst case scenario, and I've had this a couple of times with students, is that if you learn the bones of the wrist on one side, you then need to learn the bones of the wrist on the other side again, because your visuospatial ability is so poor you can't transpose those shapes into the mirror image. So you have to, for much of the body, learn twice as much as everybody else. Still doable. Those students pass, they're doctors now. But sometimes you have to almost look at twice as much anatomy. But it's always doable. Good luck. Those are my and the students here, the strong ones and the weaker ones and the middling ones. And that's the published research as well. Those are the top tips that I talk about all the time. And we have a great success rate in students completing courses, becoming doctors. Anatomy sometimes trips them up, but doesn't stop them. So good luck. Hopefully one or two of those will be useful to you. I bet you've heard most of those before and you're probably using many of them. But now you've seen how we teach here and how we study here. Add those two things together, your anatomical knowledge will become excellent and you'll have a great foundation for wherever you want to go in life after that. All right.